The unforgettable opening for George Gershwin's 1928 tone poem, as he called it, An American in Paris. But now let us fast forward to November 1951. You go to the movies on a Saturday night and you see the preview of a coming attraction, and this is just a little piece of it. Well, would you go see that movie? I sure would, especially if I were middle-aged in 1951. Because here's the thing. Let's pretend we were all middle-aged in 1951. And if that were the case, that means that it had only been 13 years since Gershwin died of a brain tumor at the age of 38. So those of us who were young in the 1920s and 30s, we felt we knew the composer and his music well. Now, in 1951, we were being promised something spectacular and classy, and boy, did we get it. 69 years after it was released, you're going to see this classic, ambitious MGM musical for the first time, or maybe for the 16th time. And I'm going to talk about it first. But one caveat. I'm not going to discuss the stage version of the show, which you probably saw at Playhouse Square just a few years ago. I really liked it. I think most people did. But comparing the stage version with the original 1951 movie, that's apples and oranges. So I'm not going to go down that road. Instead, I want to tell you about the idea for the movie. I want to tell you about the artistic team that made it. And I want to tell you about the many challenges of making this film and how the artists met those challenges as they pulled their massive project together. You know, thousands of people worked on this film and millions of people around the world saw it. And I want to tell you right off the bat that this movie won 7 Oscars, including Best Picture of the Year. It beat out both A Place in the Sun and it beat out Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Can you imagine? American in Paris, a musical, beat out Tennessee Williams. And you can't help but be impressed by the way this movie combines what we might call high art with low art, especially in the dancing. And, you know, in a way, isn't that what George Gershwin did in his music? I think so. An American in Paris was hatched over a game of pool at lyricist Ira Gershwin's house. He was then 55, living in Beverly Hills. The date has gone down in history, November 21, 1949. Ira's friendly competition at the table, and this is Ira's drawing, was producer Arthur Freed, also 55, head of the famous Freed unit at MGM. Arthur Freed and his team made the lion's share, so to speak, of the finest movie musicals of that period, including Meet Me in St. Louis, Cabin in the Sky, Easter Parade, and later on, Singin' in the Rain, The Bandwagon, and Gigi. As usual, Arthur Freed had a fresh idea. He said to Ira Gershwin, what if we made a musical built around the score for An American in Paris? And Ira said, great idea, as long as all the songs are by the Gershwin brothers. Well, that was a no-brainer. And Freed had another idea up his sleeve. His contract player, Gene Kelly, then 37, had come to him recently with an article from Life magazine about American GIs who decided to stay in Paris after World War II ended. And remember, this is 1951. So now, in Freed's mind, They had a great orchestral piece, they had a great American dancer, beloved songs, and the beginnings of the leading character. Fried was what used to be called in the business a creative producer. We've used that term in this series before. And one of the things that meant was he had the amazing instincts of putting just the right creative people together on a project. The director would have to be the ultra-sophisticated Vincent Minnelli, Liza's father, you know. Minnelli was a lifelong Francophile, which would be very important, and the director at MGM, who was the master of creating visual beauty on screen. As for the star and choreographer, Gene Kelly, of course. But who would play opposite Gene Kelly in this picture? Arthur Fried was adamant that it had to be an authentic French girl, okay? And Kelly remembered an 18-year-old dancer he had seen 2 years before with Roland Petit's company in Paris. Her name, Leslie Caron, who's still with us, by the way, at 88. Kelly gave her a screen test in Paris, and Caron won the part for what Minnelli called her gammon quality.
Nothing. I knew absolutely nothing. I didn't know what a camera looked like. I didn't know how to speak lines. I didn't know how to speak English. So as far as I can judge, my performance is just one huge question mark. What am I doing here?
And what about the screenplay? Excellent choice. Fried said Alan J. Lerner, best known, of course, as one half of the team of Lerner and Lowe, who had had such a big hit with Brigadoon in 1947. Lerner would not be writing lyrics for An American in Paris, of course. However, he liked the idea of working on what Minnelli called a Chinese puzzle. Lerner had an ending because Gershwin's An American in Paris was going to be the finale as a ballet. He had a setting, he had invented an expatriate GI named Jerry Mulligan, and he had a Parisian orphan girl named Lisa Bouvier, and he had those songs by the Gershwin brothers. Now he had to come up with the story, and as he said, build the screenplay around the songs and make the songs grow naturally out of the dialogue. He said, I wanted them to seem like original emotional expressions written for specific moments in the film. They had to have dramatic value. And of course, everything had to lead inevitably to the ballet. He made Kelly an artist, which would give Minnelli the opportunity to create a visual feast. Lerner gave him a best friend, Adam Cook, to be played by that famous pianist, wit, and frequent MGM featured player, the irascible Oscar Levant, who was then considered the definitive interpreter of Gershwin's music. And here's how Alan J. Lerner created conflict. Kelly and Caron would fall in love, of course. But Kelly would feel indebted to an older woman who loved him, his benefactor Milo Roberts, played by Nana Foch. And Caron would feel indebted to an older man who had been her protector during the war, Henri Borel, played by French singer Georges Guthrie. All of them are splendid in this movie, although, as Minnelli points out, the script had to be tailored to Gene Kelly's ingratiating personality. Minnelli said, I didn't have to give him much direction. Most of the time I could just say, play it jaunty. Well, you know, I can't think of another MGM movie musical in which such care was taken with preparing the music itself. I just have to mention three guys from the Fried unit who teamed up to pull this off. The best known was Johnny Green, who served as head of MGM's music department. He delegated much of the preparation work to two artists who really should be better known. One of them was Conrad Salinger, the other was Saul Chaplin. And this is Saul Chaplin.
As far as I'm concerned, Gershwin is the 20th century American composer. I loved everything he wrote. Now here I'm doing his music I kept thinking all the time, am I doing right by Gershwin?
And then you have this fascinating figure who really is sort of an unknown hero in the history of the musical, Conrad Salinger. He was classically trained, but with John Green, they created this sound that had the richness, the complete instrumental palette of a symphony orchestra, but with a lot of razzle-dazzle.
Chaplin recalls spending hours with Gene Kelly, Vincent Minnelli, Ira Gershwin, going over dozens of Gershwin songs to figure out what was going into the movie. They were working from Alan J. Lerner's outline for the screenplay, and Lerner had strong opinions about what was needed. And Saul Chaplin says this exercise nearly killed him. He says if Vincent and Gene had followed my lead, the film would still be running, because every time we played through another Gershwin song, I would say, well, how can we not use that? Most of the songs you're going to hear in this film are so well known to us, they're part of our collective unconscious. But there are 3 songs, anyway, that I think are real curiosities, and I'm just going to let you make the discoveries when you see the film. That's part of the fun. Saul Chaplin, was once asked to describe, in his words, the Gershwin style. He said, all I can say it is very, very American. Gershwin himself said that he considered his music to be a melting pot of cultures, which I think is a terrific explanation. And the film has lots and lots of background music. For example, Arthur Freed also wanted little bits and pieces of An American in Paris to tease us along the way in the background, because then he figured we'd be prepared for the ballet itself, especially those of us who didn't know the music at all, and many of us did not know the music, very early on. And this won't surprise you. Kelly and Minnelli pleaded with Arthur Freed to have the movie shot in Paris, but Freed said no, it just wasn't feasible. So the only shots of Paris in this movie that you're going to see are the opening, establishing shots at the very beginning. Everything else in this movie was shot on the MGM back lot, for heaven's sake. And yet Minnelli promised, I was determined that this picture was going to look as authentically French as possible, even though it was being filmed here. Everything I knew about Paris or had heard about Paris would find its way into the movie. So what did they do? Well, they had the advantage of another resident genius in the Arthur Freed unit, art director Preston Eames. And he's an important figure too. He had actually been an art student in Paris for 5 years, so he knew the lay of the land. Eames dressed up Waterfront Street, French Street, and part of the tunnel extending into Quality Street. Here's one of the final results. Notice the numbering by the art department for reference to the architectural blueprints. And years later, I just love this, Eames told Hugh Forden, I must have spent a month on Waterfront Street alone. By the way, a tank was filled with water to simulate, you guessed it, the Seine. And here's an example of perfectionism that is going to make your head spin, I promise you. Hugh Forden writes, when Preston Eames brought Minnelli his design for the Café Flaudert, Minnelli had found a photograph of the frescoes in the caves in Lascaux in central France. And with his mania for authenticity, he instructed Preston Eames to have them reproduced on the walls of the cafe. Now, I mean, really, nobody would notice that detail in the background of this scene except Vincent Minnelli, and he was so pleased to have it there. In his memoirs, he proudly states that for years, people would tell him, Frenchmen would tell him, they were convinced the whole movie was shot in Paris. So bravo, Vincent. You accomplished your mission. Another challenge was how to make the most of the only big show number that Minnelli would allow in this movie, because he didn't want it to be overblown. So the number was going to be the Gershwins' "I'll Build a Stairway to Paradise," right? Because he could use it to celebrate and also poke a little fun at the Folies Bergère with, these towering showgirls. Minnelli dubbed them, he dubbed them the Glamazons. And so they are. As you're going to hear when you watch the movie, Georges Guthrie sings this brilliantly, but apparently he could not move across the stage to save his life. So Gene Kelly literally had to teach him to walk up each stair in the number. The other problem was lighting, and this was important because it was so integral to Vincent Minnelli's signature as a director. You techies, you're going to love this. He wanted each stair to flash as Guthrie stepped up on it. But the tech guys said, that's not workable. The studio electrician said, we can't do that. But Vincent Minnelli said, oh, yes, you can. And here's what happened. They set up a console with buttons controlling the lighting of each step. And you got to remember, this was before computers. The end result, as you'll see, is pretty darn amazing. Now, how were they going to execute another Gene Kelly idea? And a very good idea at that. He wanted to perform a number with a group of kids out on the street. And they decided that they would take I Got Rhythm and use it as an English lesson. So that's what happened. They rounded up a group of emigre children to get the dance going.
I got
Rhythm,
I got
music,
I got
my gal, who could ask for anything more?
I'm Andre Guy,
And I'm Claude Guy.
and we were in American in Paris.
We were two of the kids in the I Got Rhythm number.
Ask for anything more. Old man trouble.
Gene Kelly wanted children that weren't professional, and
Well, that pretty well fit us because we weren't really actors, we were extras. And we were a little bit shy and we had a little bit of a broken English.
I got
Music,
I got
my gal, who could ask for anything more? Who could ask for anything more?
Gene Kelly was terrific. He was so nice to the kids, and he loved playing with us, even off the set. You know, he
Oh,
would
yeah.
tap dance around us,
Yeah.
and he would give us candy.
It was like sunshine when he came into the
that's
studio. I don't think I've ever in my life seen another personality like that.
It all works, don't you think, because of the sweetness and the simplicity of the concept. The dance itself is not all that complex, but it's a moment that tells us a lot about Gene's character, Jerry Mulligan, and it tells us why Leslie Caron was going to fall in love with him, because he's irresistible. Well, they wanted to avoid making the movie too sweet, after all. So, you may decide that it is too sweet, but the romantics among us, like me, we'd go to the mat with you about this. Alan J. Lerner's screenplay, by the way, actually won the Oscar for Best of the Year in 1951. And it's praised, that screenplay is praised by Vincent Minnelli as, good quote, a simple story, beautifully told, a charming story about a charming period after the war. And his characters became real people by their weaknesses as much as their virtues. Alan J. Lerner, of course, also knew that he had to have some salt to go along with the sugar, and that's where Oscar Levant comes in, playing Gene's buddy, Adam Cook. Now, Vincent Minnelli said that he wanted the movie to be hugely commercial, but that he didn't want to talk down to the audience. So that's where Oscar Levant comes in, because from time to time, Levant could toss in one of his typical cynical, self-deprecating quips, like this one. Levant says, I'm one of the world's oldest child prodigies. And you should know that Levant actually ad-libbed that line when they were filming the scene. In real life, you may know that Levant was a chronically depressed guy. In the 1950s on talk shows, he told us all about it. And in this movie, that's because Arthur Freed decreed that there would be no lulls in American in Paris. He didn't want anything to bog down the film. So Levant was not allowed to play solo piano by Gershwin in the movie, and that totally bummed him out. But one day, he had a brainstorm. What about his character having a dream in which he was soloist for the third movement of Gershwin's Piano Concerto in F, the twist being that he would also be conducting and playing various instruments beside the piano, and even applauding himself from a box in the concert hall. Manelli loved dream sequences, so he bought it. He gave it the green light, and so did Arthur Freed. And I'm not going to spoil the fun by showing you the clip. You can wait till you see the film. You may dismiss it as a stunt. I think it's just terrific because I think it's right for the character. Levant dubbed it his ego fantasy scene, and Levant was all about ego. So, depression lifted. Yet another challenge. How do you give Leslie Caron, a complete unknown in this country, how do you give her an entrance in the film that will let us know how important she's going to be to an American in Paris? Lerner had some spoken dialogue in which Oscar Levant asks Georges Guthrie about Caron, because remember, Guthrie is in love with Leslie Caron. What's she like? Says Oscar. And Guthrie answers by naming 6 of her wonderful qualities, but Manelli hadn't filmed it because he couldn't find a way to make it cinematic. But this is so cool. The great Broadway costume designer Irene Sharaff arrived at the studio around that time, and she gave them what she calls her gift. She had this idea. She was going to work on the ballet, but she had this idea for establishing Leslie Caron. She figured that Caron would appear in 6 little solo vignettes in Guthrie's mind, all of them choreographed by Kelly, of course. They would be designed by Sharaff, and they would be danced to various rhythms of embraceable you. At the end, all the images would appear on screen. So, done. And now we come to the biggest challenge in this whole movie, the American in Paris ballet itself, which comes at the end of the film. Most of the rest of the movie was shot, and the front office in New York figured it would be just fine as long as Lerner did a little writing and made sure that it had a happy ending, especially because the ballet was budgeted at something like $500,000. But Arthur Freed prevailed and said, no, remember the whole reason for doing this film in the first place was to dramatize Gershwin's tone poem. And he said, do it here, in the studio, in the Paris of the Impressionists. And they were off and running. Manelli wanted a dream ballet, Jerry's dream, motivated by Lisa telling him that she can't be with him because of her obligation to marry Henri. And nobody could do a dream fantasy like Vincent Minnelli.
Nowadays, it's very popular to think of reality and fantasy in conjunction with each other, and what is reality and what is fantasy. It's what novelists have always used. I've always leaned toward that, and I've wanted to do it more than they allowed me to.
And Minnelli, as you know, drenched his fantasies in color. Lerner gave him a great opportunity. The scene before the ballet was going to be a masked ball. And Minnelli decided that it would be all costumed in black and white, so when the dream began in color, it would just take your breath away. Minnelli, Kelly, and designer Irene Sharaff developed the plot for the ballet. Minnelli recalled, "The hero is at the lowest point in his life. It's an emotional nightmare that alternates with moments of great joy. Then he returns to the sad reality. He thinks of life without the girl. He searches for her throughout Paris. He finds her for a moment, then he loses her again, and so on. The ballet shows the conflict within the hero, his emotional turmoil." End quote. As you'll see, Kelly gave Caron strictly classical movement without sacrificing his own very American style in dance, and I think that makes for a thrilling juxtaposition in the ballet. And costume designer Irene Sharaff gets the prize for coming up with the visual key to the entire ballet. This was her reasoning. Well, if Arthur Freed wanted to evoke the Paris of the Impressionists, why not go to the extreme and create the visual style of 6 artists of the period? So that meant Dufy for the Place de la Concorde, based on a watercolor, Manet for the Flower Market, Utrillo for the Paris Street, Rousseau for the Fair, Van Gogh for the Place de l'Opéra, and Toulouse-Lautrec for the Moulin Rouge. In fact, she took Lautrec's famous jockey du Chocolat right out of a poster and suggested that Kelly bring him to life to dance. In 1951, audiences cheered this part of the ballet. Kelly himself called it strong dancing. That's for sure. I think Sharaff's idea is inspired because it works no matter who's watching it. If you're like me, I'm kind of a visual illiterate, and I can't really isolate those 6 artists I just named, though I love the ballet. But if you know your French Impressionists, it's a marvelous touch, particularly because it really kind of grows out of Gene Kelly's character as a painter soaking up the history of visual art in Paris. So it's all unified. Sharaff made sketches for the backdrops and even invented characters to populate the scenes. It took 6 weeks to do the backgrounds with 30 painters working around the clock at MGM, besides which she designed 120 costumes for the ballet. But this was easier. This was her idea. She suggested a rose as Jerry's symbol of Lisa, and I just betcha that Vincent Minnelli kissed her for that. And Minnelli was making his usual contribution as an artist obsessed with lighting. Oh, this just goes on, doesn't it? I mean, for the ballet, he brought in cinematographer John Alton, who later said of this work, "The secret of the ballet's photography was the fumata, or smoky quality, which changed all the colors to pastel. It was so exciting, we would all rush to the studio, eager to do something, even ahead of time. We were just like kids going to the candy store." Saul Chaplin was faced with the challenge of taking the Gershwin score, which Gershwin himself had orchestrated in 1928, and adapting it. That's Chaplin's word. If you know this score well, you're going to hear the editing and rearranging and repetition of themes, and the question arises, why these changes? Well, because the music had to support the story that Kelly was telling in the dance, and even the specific movements he developed as choreographer. Now, Saul Chaplin died in 1997, and he felt guilty about his adaptation until the end of his life. He said it was like fooling around with Beethoven or Brahms. But there was one big consolation, which was that Ira Gershwin loved the ballet and loved what Chaplin did with it. But, not everybody at MGM was convinced that this ballet was going to work. Vincent Minnelli recalled the day that Irving Berlin came to the studio.
Irving Berlin was visiting, and the sets were being built. Arthur Freed and Gene Kelly and myself went with Berlin and showed him all the sets. And finally he said, do I understand that you boys are planning on ending this picture with a ballet, 20 minutes, no dialogue after that? We said, yes. And he said, well, I hope you know what you're doing, I said, well, that's all we needed, because our hearts were in our mouth. It was very daring in those days to do it.
And when the board of directors in New York City got a chance to see the rough cut of the film in New York, they sat there stone-faced. Can you believe it? But you know what? Minnelli and Kelly and Freed and company not only won plaudits, they won audiences. This film that you're going to see cost $2.7 million in 1951. That would be $28.5 million today. It grossed more than $8 million, which would be $84 million today. And imagine how many Americans were seeing an actual ballet for the first time in what Minnelli called his swirl of color and light. That's so exciting, the way they were able to open up the joy and beauty of an art form for a general American audience. This film is one of the great cinematic collaborations. It really is. Gene Kelly said that they were all a kind of repertory company, and Leslie Caron says that the film was a kind of sauce that we all made together. But make no mistake, the unity of style, the unity of tone, that's all about Vincent Minnelli. He writes in his memoirs, although I don't minimize anyone's contributions, one man was responsible for bringing it all together. That man was me. Even though this movie is what's known as a blockbuster, I just have to isolate for you two little small details before we close. These details show and tell us how much everybody cared about making this movie, this piece of American art that was masquerading as American commercial entertainment. Gene Kelly and Vincent Minnelli get the nod for the moment just before the ballet begins, when Jerry Mulligan moves out of reality and into fantasy. Kelly had the idea of what might happen on screen to a sketch he had torn up. But what Minnelli does with the idea is magic on screen, and I can't wait for you to see it. And one more. Kelly and Saul Chaplin get the praise here. But they owe a debt to Rodgers and Hammerstein, I think, because R&H perfected the notion of integrating dialogue with music, lyrics, and dance. In other words, making them flow naturally from one to another. My favorite moment in this entire movie is the Love Is Here to Stay sequence, because Kelly and Caron just do something so extraordinary with it. And by the way, we only know this song well because of An American in Paris. This was the last song that the Gershwins ever wrote for a movie musical in 1938, but it didn't become popular. And it's only thanks to Kelly and Caron that this song became immortal. I really want you to watch as the scene moves from their conversation to Kelly beginning the vocal so gently as the orchestra sneaks in, and then how after the vocal it turns into just one of the most intimate and romantic dance duets that you can imagine. Their dance is, of course, truly a love scene. And Leslie Caron is truly a symbol of our post-war optimism and our love for the city of light. I'm Bill Rudman, and for heaven's sake, enjoy, okay?